Now it's time for Perspective, and my guest on the programme today is someone who's actually quite tough to introduce simply because he's done so much. I'll try and slim the list down for you to say he's a writer, a journalist, and perhaps, above all, a real advocate for Indigenous people. Now, last year he was named on the Time 100 list of emerging leaders, and he believes that Indigenous people can really contribute to understanding and addressing the world's most pressing challenges. Julien Brave NoiseCat has just finished a book, We Survived the Night. It's just being published, and he's here in Paris for Le Festival America. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us today. Did my best.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. Great to have you with us. I mean, Indigenous people can really contribute to understanding the world's most pressing challenges. What do you mean by that?
So Indigenous peoples have survived an apocalypse. We are what I would describe as a post-apocalyptic peoples. We lost our world. We lost our languages, our cultures, and the land that we depended on to survive. And in many ways, humanity is now facing apocalyptic circumstances, whether that be climate change, the rise in authoritarianism, the loss of democracy, or the pandemic that we all just lived through. These are earth-shattering events. And in my view, the experience of having survived an apocalypse now matters to more people than just ourselves. That is a human experience that, from a philosophical perspective, might lend something to our existential crises.
So effectively what you're talking about is going back to basics.
Not necessarily going back to basics, but what it might look like to live a beautiful way of life and to remember what makes us human, what attaches us to places, what attaches us to each other after something truly horrific has happened, after, in our case, a genocide was survived.
Is that possible? Because obviously life has moved on, technology has gone so far, things have changed and the world has become a different place. Is it possible to bring that talent and those resources to the modern world to make that happen, do you think?
I think that what I'm talking about is not necessarily just a return to tradition and culture, although those things are very important to me. I understand my Shuswap language. What I'm saying is that there is something in the essence of living communally, of understanding the importance of your attachment to the place you come from and the imperatives that come with that, of holding tight to your relatives and defending the land that we depend upon. That is a lesson, I believe, to more humanity than just the Indigenous part of it.
And do you think people are becoming more receptive to that message? I mean, climate change particularly is being noticed, if you like, by more and more people. And perhaps that kind of message is something that people can kind of grab onto to give them some hope for the future?
I would certainly hope so. I mean, I guess France 24 is slightly receptive to that message.
You wouldn't be here if not.
But, in 2016, for example, there was the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline at Standing Rock, where tens of thousands of environmental activists descended on a very rural part of North Dakota, making the encampments there into the third largest town in all of North Dakota. And millions of people followed that movement on the internet. So I do believe that there is a shift in perspective that is more sympathetic and empathetic to First Peoples.
Where does this come from in you? I mean, I was reading that you first really got involved back in 2019, events marking the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Alcatraz occupation. For those that don't know, that was when 89 Native Americans and their supporters occupied the island, and you got very much involved in that anniversary, didn't you?
Yes, so I grew up in an urban Native community in Oakland, California. A lot of people don't know this, but actually there are lots of Indians who live in places like Oakland. In the 1950s and 60s, there was actually a relocation program where Native people were moved from reservations to cities. And one of the cities they ended up in was Oakland, where instead of assimilating, which was the government's idea behind relocation, we created new urban Indigenous communities, and that gave rise to these movements like the Alcatraz occupation, where urban activists and student activists actually occupied a former federal prison, Alcatraz Island, to give visibility to Native rights and treaty rights and sovereignty and self-determination. So that was a huge part of my upbringing and really what drove me towards this kind of work and perspective.
And you've done a lot more since then. I mean, you campaigned to get US politician and Native American Deb Holland into the US government, and Joe Biden did exactly that. I mean, did that feel like a groundbreaking moment, if you like?
Well, I would say that it was an extension of the idea that I was just talking about Indigenous people's leadership on environmental issues. You know, Deb Holland, who's an incredible Interior Secretary, the first ever Native American cabinet secretary in United States history, which is a remarkable thing to reflect on for a moment. You know, we have existed on this land since time immemorial, and it's not until 2020 that we got our very first cabinet secretary. But she actually, Deb Holland, traveled to the camps in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and cooked green chili stew and tortillas for the water protectors there. She is, in my view, an embodiment of this kind of leadership. And interestingly, she's also the kind of leader who can bring lots of people together. She was actually introduced during her nomination hearings by a Republican congressman, the late Don Young from Alaska.
And you've been here in Paris for Le Festival America, the American festival. I mean, how has the message that you're bringing gone down there, do you think?
Well, you know, I think that there is a certain tradition in French intellectual thought. Maybe it goes back to Rousseau and the notion of the quote-unquote noble savage that is in certain ways empathetic or compassionate towards First Peoples. You know, it comes with its own quirks, I'm not going to lie. It's a little bit interesting to come over here and talk to French people about the plight of Indigenous peoples and our perspectives worldwide, when France itself still has overseas territories and its own Indigenous peoples in French Guiana, for example. But it is certainly heartwarming to know that this message is being received by people here.
So what next? What else do you think you're going to try and tackle, if you like?
Well, I do need to finish that book, actually, so it's not quite
It's not quite
yet.
finished.
Yeah,
okay,
not quite
right.
finished. I need to finish that book. I'm also working on a documentary about the search for unmarked graves at the Indian residential school that my family was sent to in Williams Lake, British Columbia. It's a very challenging project personally and emotionally. It also takes on a big issue right now in Canada and the United States and elsewhere. So that's another big thing on my radar. And after that, you know, I just really value spending time with my family, my parents, my little sister, and all my relatives back home in Canham Lake and elsewhere.
Perfect way to end. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme today. Julian Brave NoiseCat just finished, not quite finished, his book, We Survived the Night, but look out for it when it comes out. Any idea when it's going to come out?
Hopefully 2024.
Okay.
Yeah, so you got to wait a minute.
Look out for it then. Thanks very
Sam,
much.
thanks
Thanks for joining us.